withdrew. They didn't stop their terrorism against the Russians because they love Russians, they hate them, but rather because they had achieved their objective, which was clear and explicit. The objective was to drive the infidels out of the Muslim lands so that they could initiate their own reign of terror, as they immediately did. In 1990, they turned against the United States for essentially the same reasons. From their point of view, the United States is occupying Saudi Arabia, even much more significant than occupying Afghanistan for them. Their own terrorist record goes back 20 years to the time when the CIA and British intelligence and its allies organized and trained them. In 1993, they made their first attempt to blow up the World Trade Center. Actually, they had much more ambitious plans. I'm sure you know there was a Dutch government inquiry into the Srebrenica atrocities. It was just released last week. From it, we learned that at the same time that they were trying to blow up the World Trade Center, U.S. C-130s were flying radical Islamist mujahideen from Afghanistan to the Balkans, also Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters, and also a huge flow of arms going through Croatia, which took a substantial cut. They were there to support the U.S. side in the Balkan wars, while Israel, Ukraine, and Greece were arming the other side, which explains why unexploded mortar bombs landing in Sarajevo sometimes had Hebrew markings, quoting a British political scientist reviewing the report that was published last week by the Dutch government. Well, why are radical Islamists attacking the United States while continuing to work as its agents? I think there's every reason to take them at their word on their answers to this, as the scholarly literature does, and I suppose the world's intelligence agencies as well, roughly what I just said. So that's the perpetrators. But then there's another very relevant population, a population in which bin Laden's horrendous words have a certain resonance. For example, the moneyed Muslims, as they were called by the Wall Street Journal, when it surveyed the attitudes of wealthy Muslims on September 14th, right after, a couple days after the World Trade Center bombing. That means they were interviewing in the Middle East bankers, lawyers, other professionals, managers of multinationals, some of whom describe bin Laden as, in their words, the conscience of Islam, even though they despise him and they fear him. They fear him for good reasons. They know that they are his primary targets. They are very strongly supportive of U.S. policies in general, but very bitter about the U.S. role in the region. And they state their reasons. The Wall Street Journal, to its credit, reported them accurately. Namely, the U.S. supports corrupt and repressive regimes that undermine democracy and development. And then there are particular policies, such as the support for the harsh and brutal Israeli military occupation, now in its 35th year, actions that devastate Iraqi civilian society while strengthening Saddam Hussein and others. Nobody surveyed opinions in the slums and rural villages, but if they had, they'd find similar reactions, but harsher ones, because unlike the moneyed Muslims, the people there don't understand why the wealth of the region should be drained to the West and to local collaborators rather than being used for the domestic population. Well, these attitudes, which are not exactly secret, provide some of the answers to George Bush's plaintive question, why do they hate us? And those who want to add some historical depth can easily do so. You can look back at the declassified internal record. So say back to 1958, which was a crucial year in U.S. foreign policy. In that year, and the records are declassified, in that year there were three major crises in the world. Eisenhower and Dulles, President, Secretary of State, insisted that there was no Russian connection in any of them, which is incidentally rather typical of the Cold War period when you look closely at particular cases. All three were oil producers. All three were Islamic. Indonesia, North Africa, Middle East. But they were secular Islam in the three cases. In the Middle East, Eisenhower pointed out to his staff that, I'm quoting him, "The problem is that we have a campaign of hatred against us, not by the governments, but by the people." Why? Why? This is 45 years ago, not after September 11th. The National Security Council explained, highest planning body, I'm quoting them, they said, "In the eyes of the majority of Arabs, the United States appears to be opposed to the realization of the goals of Arab nationalism. They believe that the United States is seeking to protect its interest in Near East oil by supporting the status quo," that means corrupt and brutal governments, "and opposing political or economic progress." And they point out that that perception is difficult to counter since it's accurate. Our economic and cultural interests in the area have led not unnaturally to close U.S. relations with elements in the Arab world whose primary interest lies in the maintenance of relations with the West and the status quo in their countries. So that's the policy we do follow and we should follow, and it will lead to a campaign of hatred against us, much as the Wall Street Journal and others found after September 11th when they surveyed the opinions of the wealthy and the privileged, who are closely linked with Western power and support its basic objectives. Well, it's easy to go on with this, and it's not hard to understand, but educated opinion here prefers a different story, the one you've read over and over. It prefers ruminations about how they resent us because of our freedom and our love of democracy, or because of their cultural failings, which go back to the Middle Ages, or because they've been left behind by the form of globalization in which they happily participate, and so on. And we can, if we want, choose self-serving fairy tales, but it's not particularly wise, nor is it wise to pretend that we don't know the answer to Bush's question. We do. It's very hard to miss. Well, those policies continue to be operative, not only in the Middle East. Let's go back to Latin America. Here the policies are similar, and they are just as natural, to quote the National Security Council, as in the Middle East. And they're also deeply rooted. Not a great surprise to Latin Americans or to people here who want to understand our own country, for example, by looking at the rich declassified record of internal planning. For example, you can look back to a hemispheric conference in 1945, which laid out the framework for subsequent U.S.-Latin American relations. In that conference in Mexico, the United States instituted what was called the Economic Charter of the Americas. And its goal was, I'm quoting the State Department now, its goal was to counter the philosophy of the new nationalism that was sweeping Latin America. It's a dangerous doctrine which embraces policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses, and holds that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country, quoting the State Department. And of course, that's a serious misunderstanding. The first beneficiaries of a country's resources must be U.S. investors. We have to protect our resources, as George Kennan put it, top State Department planner. He was referring to the material and human resources that by accident lie elsewhere but are ours. And as he made clear and explicit, violence may be the only way. You may recall that Kennan was at the dovish extreme of the planning spectrum. He was removed in 1950 because he was considered too soft for this harsh world. And he's now revered as a great humanist. The threat of the new nationalism was overcome. The U.S. had the force to do it. One of the consequences was described by the World Bank just a few years ago. They pointed out that the region has the most unequal income distribution in the world, and there will be chaos unless governments act aggressively against poverty, which is appalling in its depth and scale. And that situation is expected to become worse. Last year, the U.S. intelligence community, with the assistance of academic specialists and people from the business world, published their projection for the next 15 years. Their projection is that what they call globalization will proceed on course, leading to a widening economic divide and greater financial volatility. Well, a widening economic divide means less globalization in the technical sense of convergence to a single market, but more globalization in the doctrinally preferred sense of concentration of wealth and power. And more financial volatility, well, that means slower growth and even more harm for the poor majority. So that's the optimistic scenario. These predictions were a few months before September 11th. There's no indication that these tendencies of the emerging world framework of world order, there's no indication that they're going to change, except in one respect. They're likely to become more pronounced, with consequences as grave as those that the World Bank predicts. And they're very deeply rooted. They're not the kind of policies that change easily. You can get some further insight into the likely effects of September 11th by looking back a few years to the preceding moment when it was widely argued that there would be a crucial turning point in world affairs, namely the end of the Cold War. That was definitively over by November 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what do we learn from that historic break? Well, I think if you look back now with 12 years, 13 years experience, we discover primarily continuity. Some tactical modifications, lots of new pretexts for old policies, but basically the same policies, the ones I've just outlined, which are indeed natural, just as the National Security Council recognized, deeply rooted in our institutions and therefore persistent. So let's take October '89, right before the fall of the wall. A national security directive on the Middle East recommended continued support for our friend Saddam Hussein, called for the use of military force where necessary and appropriate to defend our vital interests against the Soviet Union or any other regional power, not Iraq, notice. A couple of weeks later, the Berlin Wall fell. A few months later, in March 1990, George Bush, #1, sent the annual message to Congress on the Pentagon budget, same as previous years. We need a huge Pentagon budget, but now the pretexts were changed. So we still needed a huge intervention force directed at the Middle East, where, I'm quoting, the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. That's contrary to the preceding October and all the years before. In fact, the threats were exactly the same as they had always been, namely indigenous nationalism, just as in 1958, when it was internally conceded that there were no Russians, or in Latin America or Southeast Asia or Africa, in fact, if you look closely, consistently. So the policies therefore continue, but now it's not in defense against the Russians because they're not there anymore. Other policies remain intact as well. In March 1990, we still needed the enormous military system, not to deter the Russians, but in defense against the technological sophistication of third world powers. And it's necessary to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. It's a euphemism for high-tech industry. As before, the Pentagon system has to remain in order to provide a cover for the dynamic state sector of the economy that serves to socialize risk and cost while privatizing profit, and it shields concentrated private power from market discipline. It's a leading factor in economic development and in the creation of the so-called new economy, and it also has to be extended without substantial change. Same after September 11th, but just intensified. Well, back to 1990, military tactics did change. The Pentagon explained at the time that the international environment has changed from from the targets being weapon-rich, that's a reference to the Soviet Union, to being target-rich, that's a reference to the South, the former colonial world, where there are increasingly capable third world threats. It's the Joint Chief of Staff at March 1990, quite in conformity with the public message to Congress. Targets are now going to include nations capable of developing weapons of mass destruction. Well, who are they? Any nation is capable of developing weapons of mass destruction if it has some laboratories, a little bit of industry, some infrastructure, so that's just about everyone. The South is to be specifically targeted, as indeed was true, had been true throughout the whole Cold War period, but now new options are available because the deterrent is gone, so we can do it more openly and with fewer devious means. Nuclear weapons remain the centerpiece of U.S. strategy, but now enhanced to include what are called mini-nukes, which are tailored for use against rogue elements. And these change now and then. So in 1988, shortly before, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress was designated officially as one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world, while South Africa was a valued ally, having killed only 1.5 million people in the surrounding areas, forget South Africa itself, just in the Reagan years. That was part of the war against international terrorism, which is now redeclared by the same people. A few years later, that calculation changed, and the recent past goes right down the memory hole, teaching us absolutely nothing. Returning to post-Cold War planning, Clinton's Strategic Command recommended that nuclear weapons should be used, when needed, in what they called preemptive reaction. Leave it to you to figure that one out. But even if they're not used, they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict, so they must be available and visible to adversaries. The U.S. must also move on to placing offensive weapons in space. It's in violation of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which has so far been observed, and at the UN it's been reaffirmed in the last few years, the U.S. and Israel abstaining. It's being reaffirmed because everybody knows the U.S. is planning to violate it, and for good reasons, which are clearly explained in Clinton-era documents of the Space Command. They point out that in the past, navies were created in order to protect commercial interests and investments, and space is the next frontier, and we are powerful enough to monopolize it. War planners, furthermore, accept the same projections as the intelligence community. They also anticipate a growing gap between what they call the haves and the have-nots as the preferred style of globalization proceeds. Therefore, it follows that we need enormous destructive power in space on hair-trigger alert in order to control the unruly have-nots who are going to be extending with globalization. Well, these Clinton-era documents go on to give quite a chilling analysis of the intended future. They're actually not very different from the recently leaked nuclear posture review of the Bush administration, which created a considerable stir when it was leaked to military analyst William Arkin a couple of weeks ago and published. The difference in reaction raises a number of questions, but I'll put that aside and keep to the main point, which is that the basic policies remain stable through two recent critical moments, the collapse of the Soviet Union and September 11th. The primary effect of the redeclared war on terror has been to provide the United States with a major military base in Central Asia for the first time. That puts the U.S. in a strong position to dominate the energy resources of Central Asia, but also, and I think more important, it complements the intervention system that's aimed at the far richer Gulf oil reserves that goes from Guam to the Azores, but the closest nearby base up until now was the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, from which the population was expelled. The British courts have since accepted their plea, it's British Island, their plea that they have a right to return, but there's a higher authority which overturns that decision. The next target in the war on terror is supposed to be Iraq. According to Bush and Blair and Clinton administration officials and others, we cannot tolerate Saddam Hussein because he is so evil that he committed the ultimate crime. He even used chemical weapons against his own people. Those charges are completely accurate. They're missing only three little words, namely, with our support, which continued without any change for years after the ultimate atrocity. He's also charged with seeking to develop weapons of mass destruction, which I presume is probably true. But that charge also omits a slight fact, namely that the U.S. and Britain continued to provide him with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction well after his worst crimes, when he was a far greater danger than he is now. All of that means straight out that we can't possibly take these official pretexts seriously, and anyone who even repeats them is just saying, I'm a servant of power and a total hypocrite. But there are more obvious reasons. There are reasons. I mean, there are reasons and obvious reasons to overthrow the old friend and trading partner of George Bush I. Namely, he's sitting on the largest oil reserves in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia. And one way or another, the United States is likely to try to regain control over them, and the post-September 11th circumstances may do provide a window of opportunity. However, the project faces several problems. The most fundamental one, I think, is trying to find an acceptable successor regime. And that's not simple. The successor regime has to meet some conditions. It cannot allow any democratic tendencies, because if it does, the Shiite majority might influence policy towards accommodation with Iran, and the U.S. doesn't want that. And furthermore, the Kurdish minority might gain rights that would threaten U.S.-backed repression of Turkey's Kurdish population, which remains very severe. That issue is not a new one. It rose in April 1991, right after the Gulf War. At that time, a Shiite rebellion took place in the South, which might have overthrown the monster, but the Bush administration intervened. It refused to allow rebelling Iraqi generals access to captured equipment, and it authorized Saddam to use military helicopters and other armed means to drown the rebellion in blood. Later, Norman, who was in charge, claimed that he'd been snookered by the devious Saddam. He hadn't realized that when he authorized him to use air power, he would actually use it. The basic problem at that time was explained by Thomas Friedman, who was then chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, so he's articulating State Department concerns. He pointed out that the best of all worlds for the United States would be an iron-fisted Iraqi military junta ruling Iraq just as Saddam did, much to the pleasure of U.S. allies Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and of course the boss in Washington. But since clones couldn't be found, the U.S. was stuck with second best, namely Saddam himself. Well, that problem still remains. Currently, the State Department and the CIA are reported to be developing contacts with Sunni Iraqi generals, recent defectors, and they might be suitable replacements as clones. But here there are some problems too. The favorite, General Khazraji, who's Saddam's former chief of staff, he may not be able to make it to a planned meeting in Washington in a couple of weeks because he's under investigation in Denmark for war crimes, charged with participation in the gassing of the Kurds at Halabja, so some difficulties. Another problem is one that's all over the front pages, namely strong regional opposition, even from Kuwait, which of course has been exacerbated by the recent U.S.-Israeli operations in the West Bank. And they are joint operations. That's well understood in the region, even if a different story is preferred here. The story preferred here is that the United States is an honest broker trying to deal with two naughty children, One of them is a man of peace, Ariel Sharon, who sometimes gets out of control, and the other is the evil Palestinians who refuse to renounce terror. And to maintain this pose, which is close to 100%, it's necessary to overlook a few small facts, namely that one of the adversaries is the leading military power in the region, in fact, one of the most powerful in the world, fully supported by the global superpower. The other is a weak, defenseless population that the U.S.-Israeli alliance has ruled with considerable violence and brutality for 35 years, meanwhile rejecting every effort at diplomatic settlement while they proceed to integrate the territories within Israel in gross violation of international law, war crimes, severe, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. And all that continues. I already mentioned Washington's renewed steps last December to bar the obvious measures to reduce violence, and it takes considerable discipline not to see what seems obvious to commentators elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East, namely that Powell's mission was very carefully crafted to ensure that the man of peace would have time to complete his terrorist operations in the newly occupied Palestinian cities. Now, it's true that the president insisted that he must withdraw without delay, but Powell was quick to explain in a press conference right away that the words "without delay" mean as soon as possible. It kind of recalls Clinton's deliberations on what "is" means, which you may remember. The man of peace is not asked to renounce terror, and of course the master in Washington. Rather, it's the adversary who's imprisoned by Israeli tanks, unable to flush his toilet. He has to renounce terrorism in terms acceptable to the master, even though everyone understands that those statements are completely meaningless, have no effect whatsoever. Why? Well, the story's familiar. Again, it's useful to look back a bit. Powell, who's the administration's good guy, is following the model of Secretary of State George Shultz, who was the official moderate back then in the Reagan years. This was at a time when the United States was becoming an object of international ridicule in the late 80s because of its unwillingness to hear that the PLO was calling for negotiations and political settlement with increasing intensity, while the United States and its Israeli ally were refusing on the alleged grounds that the PLO had not renounced terrorism, unlike, say, the United States and Israel, which can't carry out terrorism by definition. In his memoirs, Shultz recalls all this with pleasure. He describes how he informed the President Reagan, that Arafat had said unk, and kol, but he hadn't yet said uncle with sufficient humility to be acceptable to Massa. The purpose is humiliation and degradation, not of Arafat specifically, but of the Palestinians as a whole, for whom he's a national symbol, and they have to be taught that they cannot lift their heads in standard Israeli parlance. 20 years ago, during another one of the periodic outbursts of state terror in the occupied territories, a very respected centrist commentator in Israel, Yoram Perry, wrote that 15 years, that's what it was then, 15 years of occupation have taught Israeli soldiers that the task of the army is not only to defend the state and the battlefield against foreign enemy, but to demolish the rights of innocent people because they are Arabushim, living in territories that God promised to us. Arabushim is the Hebrew word that's the equivalent of niggers or kikes. He and others were horrified not only by the vicious brutality, but also by the techniques of humiliation. For example, writing identification numbers on arms of prisoners on the day of the Holocaust, which was a practice renewed in the past few weeks, again arousing horror. 10 years before that, Moshe Dayan had informed his cabinet colleagues that the Arabs must be told that they will live